All right, welcome back. This is the second half of chapter 1, and I want to begin by just giving you an example of a controlled experiment. This is a pretty simple example, but the hypothesis that the researchers had in this case was that heat stress will cause corals to bleach. So you can see here the coral on the left is completely bleached out, whereas the one on the right is not. And this usually ends up killing the corals, is my understanding. Which is a big ecological issue because a lot of the significant proportion of the diversity that's found in oceans exists in coral reefs. But at any rate, the idea is heat stress causes this bleaching, but the researchers also hypothesize that corals that come from warm water are less subject to bleaching under heat stress than those from cooler waters, the idea being that they have, adapted to those warmer environments, at least to some extent. So to try and test this in a controlled method, they basically are transplanting corals from either warm or cool pools into aquaria in the laboratory where they can very tightly control the temperature of the water. They're then hitting those corals with daily temperature cycles, inducing heat stress, and then measuring the amount of bleaching, basically looking at the ratio of chlorophylls in the corals and just making the quantitative comparison that way. And you can see some of the data they got here shows that the corals that came from the warmer waters originally actually show less bleaching than those that came from cooler pools when subject to the same heat shock in the laboratory. So it would really be impossible to do this kind of comparison out in nature because, yeah, you could look at corals from cooler waters or warmer waters, but there's no way to control the heat shock to try to induce that. So it becomes much more difficult to really draw any conclusions from what you're seeing in the wild, whereas from these kinds of controlled experiments, you can pretty definitively say, yeah, okay, the heat shocking is causing this bleaching, and those corals that have been living in warmer waters seem to be a little bit better adapted to avoiding that particular bleaching. But in some cases, keep in mind, controlled experiments just may not be possible, right? Especially in biology, where you are looking at living organisms and you're mostly interested in, well, what happens to these organisms out in the wild, right? Sometimes you may have to do comparative experiments where you're just comparing between, let's say, groups of organisms out in the natural world. And of course, in that case, you can't control all the variables, right? Because the environment is going to be different from location to location. The organisms are not all being treated exactly the same way, but in certain instances, you can still gather some very useful data from these kinds of comparative experiments. So ideally, if possible, we'd like to do a controlled experiment and then maybe supplement or complement those with some comparative experiments out in the wild. And also keep in mind, anytime you're gathering data, especially quantitative data like we were just looking at, researchers are going to run some kind of statistical analysis. And so the basic idea behind statistics, if you haven't taken a statistics class, is that anytime you run an experiment, there could be what's called the null hypothesis, which is basically saying there's not going to be any significant effect, right? The temperature of the water the corals came from is not going to affect their ability to be bleached in any way. That would be the null hypothesis. And then there's the alternate hypothesis that says, yeah, the temperature of the water that the corals developed in, lived in, is going to affect their sensitivity to heat shock bleaching. And so you get the data, and sometimes, very often in fact, the data may not be super clear cut, right? It may not be entirely obvious from looking at the results. Okay, well, looks like maybe there's a bit of a trend, but I'm not entirely sure. So there are, very structured mathematical tests that apply to different types of data, but that can help you make a strong argument, help you determine whether or not the null hypothesis is true, whether or not a difference really exists or not, basically, using the power of math to bolster your argument. So if you have a chance to take a statistics class, I'd encourage you to do so, because it can be extremely useful if you're planning to pursue a career in science or medicine in any way. And of course, it's become increasingly important, especially in the modern world of fake news and all the like, to try to distinguish between science and non-science. And there's a lot of stuff out there that may be parading as science, but really doesn't utilize the scientific method, is not testing any specific hypotheses, so really shouldn't be considered science as such. So really, the way to identify good science is that it was following the scientific method. A hypothesis was proposed, tested. That hypothesis, to be a good hypothesis, has to be testable, right? If not, there is no experiment to do, and there has to at least be the potential that that hypothesis could be rejected, that it was false. Otherwise, you already know the answer, and again, it's not really good science if you already know the outcome. So really, this is the way science works: is somebody does an experiment, right, proposes and tests a hypothesis, they get their results and they share that with the rest of the scientific community. Somebody else comes along and tries to repeat that, and if they can't, they're going to call foul and say, no, something's wrong here, this isn't right. So that's kind of reassuring, because science is inevitably self-correcting. It's not always right. Every individual experiment or the conclusions drawn from it are not always right. But over time and as a whole, science is very, very good. The scientific method is excellent at honing in on the truth. Right? It is a tried and true method for uncovering the truth. So yeah, good science is going to be reproducible. There's going to be some of these quantifiable observations associated with it. All right, then lastly, why does biology matter, right? Why study biology? I realize some of you are taking the class because it's required for your major, because you want to apply to a graduate or professional school that requires you to take a biology class. But if you enjoy eating food, right, pretty much all of modern agriculture depends on our understanding of biology. If you like having a good medical system, being able to get medicine when you're sick, right? That's all based off of our understanding of biology. Biology and medicine are very tightly linked. You want to have a nice environment to live in, right? Our understanding of biology is critical to trying to maintain healthy ecosystems and understand biodiversity. And as we see more and more, especially at the time I'm recording this, is in the middle of the COVID pandemic, biology is very important. Our understanding of biology and medicine in terms of informing sound public policy. So I wanted to end just giving you one example of biological study that could influence public policy. And this is a pretty simple example, and this goes back to an image I showed you earlier of a researcher tagging some bluefin tuna with some radio trackers. And so the issue here was that in the Atlantic Ocean, there are really these two different populations of bluefin tuna. There's the western population here, represented by the red dots, and the eastern population represented by the blue dots. And what researchers had found in previous studies was that the western population was declining, right? It was basically being overfished. And so they were worried that the population could collapse, and that would have obvious negative economic implications, as well as the clear environmental implications of that. So based on the fact that we wanted to try to help those numbers of the western population recover, policymakers had kind of drawn this imaginary line right through the middle of the Atlantic, and they had established lower fishing quotas on the left side of that line and higher quotas on the right side. And so what the researcher that we saw on that earlier slide was doing was tracking those tuna just to see where they're spending their time in the Atlantic. And what those researchers found, as you can see here, is that some of the fish from the western population, again the red dots, are just completely ignoring that imaginary line, right, and spending some of their time on the other side, kind of in the middle of the Atlantic there. So what does that mean? Well, if policymakers are really serious then about trying to protect that western population, they should probably move that line farther to the east to try to include these fish that are spending time on the eastern side of that line. So anyway, pretty simple example, but of course there are tons and tons these days of biological medical research being used to advise governments and help influence policy decisions.